Hi guys, Owen here. Just a quick series of announcements before we begin the episode. Firstly, myself and my guest had been planning to record the episode outside of Trim Castle, given that it's the biggest Norman castle in Ireland, and also to acknowledge the Norman presence in Sicily. However, owing to weather conditions and the fact that I have a cold at the moment, this was not possible, so we ended up recording the episode virtually. Also, sticking with the cold, my voice quality might not be up to my usual standard, but I hope that it is acceptable for you, my listeners. Finally, I just want to say a few words about the break music, Casta Diva, from Vincenzo Bellini's Opera Norma. Bellini, born in 1801 in Catania in Sicily, is a name that is synonymous with the city of Catania, and to a certain extent with the island of Sicily as a whole. The airport in Catania, the main airport in Sicily, is known as Vincenzo Bellini Airport. So I thought it would be fitting to include this well-known piece of music in keeping with the theme of the episode, and his name will also be mentioned a few times over the course of this podcast in the next 30 minutes or so. And with that, I hope you enjoy the show. Hello and welcome to History House. I'm your host, Owen Delaney. Let's begin. Today, we are recording a very special episode with a very special guest, Catania in Sicily, with Salvo Zito, a very good friend of mine from Sicily, but very much an Irishman at heart.
Hi Owen, hi everyone. First of all, let me thank you for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here today.
It most certainly is, and we're going to talk a lot about history. We're going to talk about the history of Catania, the history of Sicily as a whole, and also the various people that were in Sicily. So the Greeks, the Romans, the Normans, etc. And I did mention the Normans in my previous Laudabiliter episode. It's actually quite surprising that the Normans were not only in Ireland, but also in Sicily.
Yeah, by the way, if some of our listeners have missed the previous episode, I strongly recommend checking it out. But yeah, correct. There's a bit of Norman blood in me, right?
Really? What's the story with that?
Yes, as a Sicilian, my ancestry is deeply tangled with quite a number of peoples, like a tapestry woven with threads from many different cultures. Part of my blood is Greek, part is Roman, part is Arabic and Germanic, but also Norman. That's why I can feel a connection with Ireland. It's interesting, isn't it? Normans in Sicily, Ireland.
Absolutely, they were all over the shop, so to speak, as we would say in Ireland. So we have a lot to cover here. So we better get started. So Salvo, you are from the proud city of Catania in the east of Sicily. Can you tell me a bit about the history of Catania, who founded it, etc.?
Of course. Well, I'd start by saying that Catania is a very old city. According to archaeological evidence, it was founded between 728 and 729 BC by Greek colonists, and they called it Catania. Of course, there were other people who already lived there. However, since we're talking about 3,000 years ago, and since I am not a historian, even though I love history, I hope that our listeners would forgive me if I chose not to delve too deeply in the pre-Greek era. Besides, the sources I found do not always agree, and I guess this is comprehensible when we're discussing events so distant in time. Anyways, I can tell you that our knowledge about the foundation of Catania is mostly based on both archaeological findings and mentions in the history of the Peloponnesian War by the Greek historian Thucydides from Athens.
And then the Romans came, right?
Yes, absolutely. The Romans conquered Catania and changed its name to Catina. All of Sicily became a Roman province.
So what happened after the fall of the Roman Empire?
Well, then, for a few centuries, it was involved in the wars between the main protagonists of that period, Germanic tribes, the Byzantine Empire, and the rising Arabic Empire. Eventually, the Arabs conquered the entire island and called Catania Medinat al-Fil, the city of the elephant. This is an interesting point I'd like to discuss later. In the 11th century, the Normans arrived in Sicily and established their dominion, and so Catania became a Norman city. Then, because of the complicated rites of succession, Catania has been Swabian, French, and Spanish. In the 1800s, finally, part of the Kingdom of Italy. I find it interesting that Catania became Italian in the modern political sense before Rome or Venice.
Interesting. Are there any important cultural events in Catania, and what is the history behind them?
Well, to answer your question, I imagine that I should firstly mention something which Catania is intimately tied to, and that is the volcano Etna. You know, Catania's flag is red and blue to signify its roots in the blue Ionic Sea and the red lava from the volcano. The volcano created the conditions for a very fertile soil, which provides food and hence life to the city, whereas the sea has always represented a source of life through seafood and trade. However, in the 17th century, Etna was responsible for two of the most catastrophic events regarding Catania: a terrible eruption and an earthquake. The disaster was so impactful that even if someone from back then saw the city today, they would not probably recognize it.
What happened with this eruption?
In 1669, the volcano erupted. I'm sure most of the listeners are familiar with what happened in Pompeii. Well, leaving the true technical differences aside, that can give you an idea of what happened in Catania. Imagine that for more than 100 days, a burning river of lava descended from the volcano, swallowing houses and villages. When it reached the outskirts of Catania, it covered an entire lake and the river. The city walls somehow managed to sway the flow, directing it towards the sea. Some Roman buildings were covered, and again, if I mention the arena track where chariots raced and the Naumachia Theater, where water was let in to simulate naval battles, I know that a few Hollywood movies might help our listeners know what I'm talking about. Apart from that, swaying the lava flow also created an entirely new neighborhood. Can you imagine? This is why Frederick II Castle, at that time a prison, ended up as an inner city castle, despite until that moment it had been on the coast. If you go there, you can still see what its prisoners carved on the walls of their cells. And of course, you will see ships, because that's what they saw before the eruptions, the harbor. The second event, which looks almost incredible, given the disaster we just mentioned, is that 24 years later, in 1693, a violent earthquake shook the eastern part of Sicily. Some sources report it as the most powerful that's ever been registered on the Italian territory. Most of the buildings were destroyed, and the casualties in Catania passed 50% of its population. One person in two was dead. It was terrible.
Well, it's sad to hear about events like this, so many people dying and so much destruction, but at the same time, Catania has always rebuilt stronger, and one of the most famous expressions of the culture of Catania is St. Agatha's Festival. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yes, of course. St. Agatha's Festival, which, by the way, will take place on the first days of February. It normally attracts about 1 million people every year from many countries, which makes it one of the biggest Catholic festivals in the world. The third, according to some people. It celebrates one of the two patron saints of Catania, Agatha, the other one being Julius.
Who was she?
I'd start by saying that this festival is a beautiful example of an old tradition which blends history and myth and primarily involves Romans, the Eastern Romans, that we call Byzantines, and the Normans. According to the tradition, Agatha was a young woman. Since she was a good Christian, she refused the courtship of the evil Roman governor, Quintianus. This man had decided that she had to be his. So he first arrested and then tortured her as a Christian. Agatha died, brutally murdered, in 251 AD. Her martyrdom, however, soon gave rise to worship. But that's not the end of our story. Today, Agatha's relics are displayed inside a golden bust, in a 4-day celebration where the bust is hand-dragged by devout people throughout the city. And they're joined by smaller chariots which mostly represent the devotion of the old city guilds. Well, there was a time when St. Agatha's relics weren't in Catania. The legend has it that the colossal Byzantine general George Maniakis sold them and brought them to Constantinople during the Byzantine attempt to reconquer Sicily from the Arabs. But 86 years later, Agatha reappeared to two soldiers and told them to bring her back to Catania, where she arrived on the 17th of August, 1126. According to part of the tradition, she was welcomed by Catania's bishop and a crowd at the Norman castle in the village of Acicastello and escorted in a procession until Catania.
And then there's the Veil of St. Agatha.
Right, I cannot forget to mention Il Velo di Sant'Agata, St. Agatha's veil, as you said. It is a veil that's preserved in a special container and until today has been displayed in occurrence of natural disasters. The most famous was certainly the eruption I mentioned before. It is said that the veil saved Catania at the time by changing the lava flow course. This is also where the devout people's attire derives from. It is called sacco, and it's a white tunic with a round hat, and that's what people wore when they were in the sleep in the 17th century. People wear it today in memory of that night in 1669 when the lava almost reached the city, waking up the people of Catania, and the veil saved them.
A lot of history there in that story. Speaking of history, what historical sites should people visit if they come to Catania?
Without any doubt, I would recommend visiting the entire city centre. And the best way would be by following Vitaliano, the long street which crosses Catania vertically until the commercial harbour. Walking this beautiful street, you can skip Villa Bellini, the main park in Catania, named after the famous composer Vincenzo Bellini, who composed the Norma, and whose face was printed on old lira banknotes. If I'm not wrong, you mentioned something like that in one of your previous episodes.
Well, I did do an episode on the figure on the old Irish banknotes, Lady Lavery, but I hate to interrupt you and tell it a good story.
Thank you, Owen. So after Villa Bellini, a visitor shouldn't miss taking a look at the facade of the main post office building, and then walking straight to Piazza Sicily, where you have churches related to St. Agatha's, Vincenzo Bellini's statue, and most of all, the remains of Catania's amphitheatre. It is only partially visible, but its biggest part still lies underground. It's a bit like visiting the Colosseum, but with half of the tour happening on the ground.
Wow.
Well, the same square on the other side is the famous Fiera o Lumi, the biggest permanent fair in Catania. Continuing on Vietnam, I recommend visiting first the famous intersection called I Quattro Canti, the Four Corners, and from there the Acchianata di San Giuliano, St. Julian's Slope, which is steep, but that's where St. Agatha's chariot is dragged by hand by the devout people every year. At the end of the slope, you'll see the amazing Benedictine monastery, an art masterpiece. And from there, a visitor can just turn around and walk back downhill, this time exploring the side narrow streets full of beautiful villas, churches, squares, and steep stairways which will lead you to Catania's university life and general nightlife.
What about food? I mean, a man's got to eat.
You're right. Also, there's a lot of typical Sicilian restaurants around there. You can taste traditional dishes, sweets, but also street food and typical drinks. After eating, by meandering in the tangled streets, you'll come again across Vietnam, the University Square, the Opera Theatre, and of course, Piazza Duomo, where the cathedral is and where St. Agatha rests. This is also where the elephant statue is. Remember the Arabic name of Catania? Well, presumably it was chosen because of this beautiful lava stone elephant, probably made during the Roman era. And today, it's surmounted by an obelisk and a cross. You can see the elephant also on Catania's flag and on Catania's soccer team's logo. Finally, in the same area, don't miss the Greek Odeon and the fountain that we call L'Acqua Linsoru, which means bed sheet-shaped waterfall. That fountain is actually a very small visible part of the river, which still flows under Catania after lava covered it in the 17th century. I might go on mentioning the other permanent fair, where you can buy live fish and where some butchers still display their meat in a way that reminds the Arab one, or the door in the city walls has been built by Emperor Charles V. But what I like for a visitor is to get lost in the flavors and the visual beauty of Catania. Just go wherever their instinct leads them.
And what about the outskirts?
Well, I strongly suggest visiting part of the countryside and the sea villages. There are a few surprises, such as one of the oldest trees in the world and the place where the Cyclops, Polyphemus, supposedly threw the three rocks at Ulysses, as Homer told us in the Odyssey. Also, Etna surely deserves a visit as well. It is the highest volcano in Europe. Apart from skiing and hiking, you can see the Valle del Bove, a more than 64,000-year-old valley. It's 5 kilometers wide and 6 kilometers long, covered with lava rock and semi-active craters. Looks like another planet. It is one of the most beautiful natural wonders I've ever seen. And if you're interested in World War II, Catania also hosts a very well-designed museum about Operation Husky, when the Allied conquered Sicily in 1943. There are exhibits and a first-person experience about bombings and life in Catania before the war.
Circling back to earlier in history, to the Greeks, how did they arrive in Sicily?
Well, what we know is that Sicily was part of the wider city-state system called Magna Graecia. or Magna Grecia, as some people say. Important cities such as Syracuse were part of it. Catania was probably founded by Greek colonists who had previously founded Naxos, north of Catania.
Well, there still is a lot to cover, and we've only just scratched the surface. We'll take a short break and continue with our story then. See you all soon. Welcome back. Before the break, we talked about Catania and the early history of Sicily, leaving off at the Greeks. Of course, the Greeks and later the Romans were not the only people who came to the island. Many people might be surprised to know about the fact that the Arabs and Normans ruled Sicily for a period of time. Why did they come to the island?
Well, after the western part of the Roman Empire fell, many different peoples from Germanic tribes flowed into its former territories. They didn't only cross Europe, but they crossed the Straits of Gibraltar, reached Africa, and continued their march eastbound. From there, they crossed the sea again, reaching Sicily. The reason why I've mentioned these events is to provide a little background to our listeners. We need to imagine an island where people spoke Greek and Latin, with a culture that was already more than 1,000 years old. In this context, first the arrival of Gaiseric from the Vandals, and then the war conducted by the Byzantines to bring Italy back under Roman rule, had a great stabilizing effect on the island, which became increasingly weaker in terms of defense. On the other hand, the Arabs who came from the east had started to build an important and flourishing empire, regaining control of arts and becoming masters in sciences. In that context, they created emirates in the lands they conquered as they marched following the same steps the Germanic tribes had taken, but coming from the opposite direction. They gained control of all the North African coast, Sicily, and most of Spain and Portugal. They were defeated at the French border on the Pyrenees. They remained in the Iberian Peninsula until the 15th century, whereas Sicily was lost to the Normans after about 2 centuries.
And what did the Arabs do when they came to Sicily?
The Arabs brought to Sicily a number of innovations, such as the cultivation of lemons and oranges, and a new way of letting water flow throughout the arid parts of the island. They also left a strong imprint on Sicilian architecture. We mustn't forget that the Norman king Roger II surrounded himself with many Arab experts and scholars, inviting them to his court. The famous geographer Al-Idrisi, for example, wrote the Tabula Rogeriana, one of the most advanced medieval world maps. But we cannot forget all the artists who participated in the construction of the Palatine Chapel in Palermo, along with Christian artists. It's a beautiful example of Byzantine, Norman, and Fatimid styles, all blended together. It may be interesting to know that practically since its construction, about 1,000 years ago, every Sunday the service is still provided in Latin. In conclusion, I will definitely say that Sicily might be considered one of the first examples of cultural and ethnic melting pots in history.
Where would you recommend going to see examples of this Arab and Norman style in Sicily in terms of architecture?
Well, as I said, in Palermo, you can admire the Palatine Chapel, Cappella Palatina, but also the Monreale Cathedral, both with breathtaking mosaics and a blend of styles, but also Palazzo dei Normanni, where the Sicilian regional government has its seat. In Catania, on the one hand, Arab rule lasted a little less than in western Sicily, but above all, Catania has largely been rebuilt after the 17th century, and therefore its architectural style looks different, more oriented towards Baroque and liberty. Anyways, if you look thoroughly at the hundreds of monuments and palaces, you can glimpse traces of the Arabic style in Catania as well. I would safely say that the entire Sicily is worth visiting, and in your tour, it's not difficult to stumble upon Arabic traces here and there.
Very interesting. Who are some of the giants of history in terms of Sicily?
Well, of course, as you know, the region where the work is full of culture and important figures. Apart from the ones I mentioned, a number of compelling characters were either born or involved with Sicilian history. Greek philosophers such as Empedocles, Roman jurists such as Cicero, who, even if wasn't born in Sicily, wrote one of his most important works against Sicily's Roman governor, Gaius Verres. We've mentioned Muslim historians and Norman kings, but I think one of the most famous characters is Frederick II Hohenstaufen, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, who was born in Sicily. An Englishman, if I'm not mistaken, has defined him as stupor mundi, the word's amazement. More recently, we can forget the composer, Vincenzo Bellini, so there would be a lot to tell, and we don't have enough time in this podcast.
Well, fair enough. Naturally, some of our listeners will now be interested in visiting this island to discover some of the locations and people you mentioned. Any tips for visitors coming to Sicily?
Well, the entire island is like a treasure chest, definitely worth visiting in each of its parts. But briefly, I recommend the temples in Agrigento and the Scala dei Turchi, a unique steep slope made of blinding white stone that rises directly from the sea. In Trapani, the beautiful Erice, Salinunte, and the salt evaporation ponds in the far west of Sicily, and sunsets in the west coast are amazing. Palermo is an amazing city as well, full of beautiful spots and flavors, and a unique blend of architectural styles. Its surroundings, such as Cefalù, are amazing as well. Lots of food and culture around there. In Messina, I recommend Pindari, Milazzo, and Taormina, of course. In Siracusa, the cathedral is a breathtaking piece of art in a beautiful setting, Ortigia Peninsula. If you pay attention, you can still see the signs left by the hammers, where the early Christian reconverted the pagan temple into the present cathedral. The Sicilian hinterland offers breathtaking landscapes and amazing cities, perched on mountains like Enna. But let's say that Caltanissetta and Ragusa have quite a lot to offer as well, in terms of views, food, architecture, and history. I'm sure I'm forgetting many places, so I apologize to all of the listeners from other parts of Sicily who would like to hear the name of the city in this podcast. But we have a little time, and I'm sure you'll understand. The truth is that each Sicilian city and town would deserve an entire episode.
Well, quite the journey through history here. From Greeks to Romans, from Arabs to Normans, and later many more peoples. Salvo, you've given us quite a ride, and I'm sure my listeners will be eager to explore some of the places you mentioned. So thank you, my friend. Grazie amico me.
Grazie a te, amico compare.
Well, that's it for today. Join me again on the 14th of February for our Valentine's Day special about the figure behind India's most famous love stories, Anarkali, the supposed lover of the Mughal Emperor Jahangir. And until next time, keep her lit, or as translated into Sicilian,
Tienila giornata.